All right, so this is our big discussion tonight. We're focusing on the death penalty in Kenya. Like we said at the start of this program, it is hard to come by statistics on the death penalty in Kenya. So some of the statistics I'm going to present to you in a short while have been gleaned from various civil society organizations. But first, let's understand the anchorage of this in law. So this is what the Penal Code says, that any person who is found to have taken the life of another by unlawful act or omission is guilty of murder. And it goes on to say that any person who's convicted of that crime shall be sentenced to death. That is what the Penal Code says. Now, the Constitution says something maybe similar. Let's take a look at that. It says every person has the right to life, except to the extent authorized by this Constitution or any other written law. Now, it's important to note that juveniles and women who are pregnant are exempt from the death penalty. So as long as the crime was committed while they were underage, or even a woman who's with child at the time of the trial, will not be sentenced to death. So let's get into some of those crimes that attract the death penalty there. We've just talked about the Penal Code and talking about murder. So here they are. We have murder, we have robbery with violence, we have treason. Before we move to the next one, this is causing a bit of controversy. Treason, remember, is a political offense. So some are starting to question whether this should be on the list in the first place. Now, let me explain something about robbery with violence. If you live in this country, you either have experienced this or know somebody who has. It could be carjacking, a gun put to your head, or a knife put to your throat. But the interpretation of this could be very simple. It could be the young man in the village who steals a chicken with a stick in his hand. That could be considered robbery with violence or armed robbery. So these are just some of the ones. But there's also something else that is added onto this list of those who, the crimes that attract the death penalty. The Kenya Defense Forces Act 2012 came into being, and it put some of these crimes under the death penalty. That's treachery, spying, and aiding the enemy. Now, what happens to those who are sentenced to death in this country? They're held in the 7 maximum security prisons in the country. That's Kamiti, Naivasha, Kibos, Kingongo, Manyani, Kodiaga, and Shimo Latewa. And we will get to the conditions under which they're held as they're waiting to die in just a moment. So, just how many people are on death row in this country at the moment? Now, before we get to that, though, let's talk about this one here. The government commuted the death sentences of 4,000 prisoners who were on death row to life. That happened in 2009 by President Mwai Kibaki at the time, and he actually opened up the space for national dialogue on this issue. He wanted a national debate on whether we should continue to sentence people to death but not actually execute them. So these are some of the numbers we have here, and we've gotten these figures from the UN Human Rights Committee. In 2012, 1,582 people faced the death penalty in this country, and these numbers here, before we move forward very quickly, these sentences were actually handed down in a period of just 3.5 years between this time, when President Kibaki commuted those sentences to life, and 2012. So in 3.5 years, we sentenced 1,582 people to death in this country. Let's take a look at some of the other statistics. I just want to give you a variation of what exists out there. In 2013, according to this organization, that's the Penal Reform International and Foundation for Human Rights Institute, 2,000 people were on death row, a bit of a different figure from the UN there. Now, it's important to note that Kenya abstained from 4 votes at the United Nations General Assembly on a moratorium on capital punishment. Many have complained that there is no political will to abolish the death penalty and that it leaves those who've been sentenced to death in legal limbo. Death row syndrome is something that has been alluded to here. So what happens to the people who are on death row? You do not work in prison, you do not engage in any activity simply because you are waiting to die. So let's continue to look at some figures. The number of death sentences handed down per year. Like I said, we quoted some statistics there that were shocking. So let's break them down by numbers. This again from Amnesty International. In the year 2010, 5 people sentenced to death. The number continues to increase to 11 in 2011 and 21 in 2012. That economic survey report saying 32% of all death sentences worldwide are handed down by courts in this country alone. So what has been happening with this discussion? There have been some court petitions, and I'd like to take you through some of them now. Now, in 2010, Mutiso versus the Republic. He was sentenced to death. And he went to court and he actually quoted the death row syndrome and he wanted an appeal of it. So he was against the arbitrariness and inhumane treatment. So basically what happens is when you have committed or accused of committing those crimes that attract the death penalty, there is no mitigation. The automatic sentence is death. And that is what he was against. He talked about it violating the constitutional protections. He also quoted the death row syndrome that we're talking about there. Now, what happened was he was able to win that case and they said, okay, all right, this makes some sense. But then, 2013, 3 years later, Joseph Mara went to court actually quoting that previous ruling in 2010. But in this case, his death penalty was upheld. Now, the court reasoned that whether or not that mandatory death penalty is constitutional should be decided by Parliament. They said the death sentence is not cruel, inhumane, or degrading as it is not applied sadistically. Now, all of these then culminated in another case that is before the Supreme Court at this moment. But let me just give you some studies from a country which is well known for having the death penalty, some states at least. There was a study conducted by professors at Emory University. They did 12 academic studies between the years of 2001 and 2007. Now, some of the correlations here might be a little off the mark. I don't know. You be the judge. Now, 9 out of those 12 studies concluded that the death penalty saves lives. Why? Let's break it down a little bit for you now. Apparently, according to those studies there that were conducted by those professors, 1 execution deters an average of 18 murders in the countries, in the states that actually practice the death penalty in the United States. This is another one. So for every 2.75 years that were cut from an inmate's stay on death row, at least 1 murder was prevented. Now they're trying to make this correlation between putting people to death and a lowering of the crime rates in that country at the time. Here's something else I want you to ponder on, some food for thought, even as we consider this case in Kenya. John Holt is the author of Freedomnomics. Now, he was able to track the death penalty in the United States between 1991 and the year 2000. This is what he found, and this is controversial at best. He said that there were 9,114 fewer murders per year during this period, and during the same period, number of executions increased by 71 per year. So what he was basically saying, more execution, fewer murders. Execution being a deterrent factor there. Now, this would be difficult to know in Kenya because we haven't executed anyone since 1987 when Hezekiah Ochuka, the mastermind of the 1982 coup, was put to death. So where does that leave us now? Is this something that would be that silver bullet, like we say, serial killers, terrorism in the country? Interesting conversation.
Definitely an interesting conversation. Just something to note from the United States is how well they've been able to track and correlate the number of death sentences that have been handed down and the number of murders that have reduced. I don't know whether that's something that we can do in Kenya, considering that these statistics are not open source per se.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that's definitely something that should inform this kind of a discussion. So we're not just speaking in terms of our own convictions.
Right. So the guests tonight, very quickly, we have Honorable Irungu Kangata, Honorable John Waiganjo, and Country Director, Amnesty International, Justice Nyangai. They'll all be joining in the conversation. You can as well. 22155 is the SMS number. Is the death penalty the silver bullet? Should we start executing people today?